When SCAN was still in its infancy, it was a different time. It doesn't feel like 1992. It's not that long ago.
Yeah, that seems so recent.
I mean, that's what, 26 years ago? Which isn't that much time, really, especially in terms of social change, because normally social change is incredibly slow. And what's happened in terms of the US's acceptance and recognition of the rights of gays and lesbians has happened so fast. I mean, when I was at SCAN, if you had asked me whether gay marriage would ever exist, I would have told you were crazy. But it's here, and it's great. It's so. Abrogating anybody's citizenship is a bad thing for the entire community, but we don't often acknowledge that, I don't think. But it doesn't, it has to hurt us. It can't be good to say that someone is less than. Mm-hmm. There's just, that means somebody else is taking the position of being more than. That's not so good. So working for SCAN was kind of a crazy thing. We were a pretty tight-knit group. Because I think everybody else faced the exact same questions and comments and concerns that I did. And there were a certain percentage of people in the male gay community that also didn't really like working with women. So that was a surprise, and it was like, oh. And the fact that I was not only married but also had babies, people found really, not quite the thing to do. Yes, I think only one person referred to me as a breeder, and that was basically as a joke. So, but it was a term that was used for people who were like me, who were working in the whole area of HIV and AIDS. And it was usually a real insult. The person who was teasing me about it was one of our guys who was also a drag queen, so he was very funny. He was great, Brian. But it was a funny combination of many different factors, but for me, having grown up in an incredibly white, very middle class suburb outside of Boston, this was the first time in my life I had stepped outside of the mainstream. And it was, in a weird sort of way, liberating, because you're not the good girl anymore because you're doing this thing. And people would question me people would be confrontational with me all the time about this sort of thing, in mild ways, mostly. But also being at a social occasion where somebody would tell an incredibly homophobic joke. And when I first was working there, it was sort of like, just moved, like, okay, fine, and, move away. But I did get to the point that I would look at somebody and say, do you have any idea how offensive that joke was? Because I was angry about that at one point, and I don't get angry very easily. But it was so tone deaf that somebody would tell me that joke. Really? Really? Why would you do that? So occasionally it was uncomfortable for people because I just stopped backing down. And I stopped being polite about that issue because people were dying. I mean, you can't be in that and not have it change you. But it was actually liberating because it's like all the sort of social convention, normal white woman bullshit. It was like, it's just that. It's bullshit. We are human beings. We all have talents. We all have deficits of one kind or another. But when it comes right down to it, we're all the same. So where did these hierarchies of weirdness come from that said, you're okay, ooh, you're not, sort of. And that was even beyond color. That was just gender. So it's like, then it goes from there. So then if you're also, HIV positive and a person of color and female, you were like on the bottom rung of that particular ladder, just because people didn't get it, they didn't understand that what people were trying to come to grips with. And the medical establishment was also a difficult place to be. One of the main HIV/AIDS docs was at Hershey, but Hershey had nobody in their emergency room in those days who spoke Spanish. So one of our caseworkers would get called out at all kinds of god-awful times of the day or night to go to Hershey and be able to translate for somebody. Now, since then, obviously, many translations, there's now the online translation services and there's lots of other things. But in those days, that wasn't there yet. And you needed somebody right there. And then, of course, Spanish isn't just Spanish. Because if somebody's from Central America, if they're from Puerto Rico, if they're from Haiti, well, not Haiti, because that's Creole, but different parts of the world, the words are, especially medical words, are not always exactly the same. So there would be difficulties even with her doing the translation sometimes to try to really, because these are intense and emotional and deep things that people were trying to talk about. So I think it shook up the medical establishment hugely and in a very positive way because they needed it and they had to open their eyes and be able to treat everybody. And I think a lot of people didn't want to, was my sense. So I was in charge of doing development work, so that meant the AIDS Walk was our primary fundraiser, and I don't have the numbers right offhand, but I think I know we raised in the each of the walks that I was involved with raised at least $80,000. And people were wonderful. And there were still gay bars downtown. Some of them have gone away because and I was just reading an article, evidently lesbian bars have almost completely disappeared because they've gotten sort of subsumed into other things, which I think is kind of sad because everybody likes to be in a room where everybody's just like you once in a while, even if not all the time. It's like being with a group of women rather than in a mixed group can be very silly and a lot of fun in a way that you wouldn't have if there were men in the room. But I thought that was kind of sad. But the bars did this thing for months before the walk. They would have jars on on the bar for people to make contributions. And they'd have drag shows to raise money and all sorts of things to raise money. So it wasn't just the money we raised it wasn't all associated with that day. There had been people raising money for months beforehand. And so, as more and more people became public about their health conditions, of course, that meant more families affected, more friends affected, more classmates, it sort of rippled out. So as people became public about their status, often that meant that there was somebody else who started fundraising because they saw what was happening and because there was so little to do for folks at first, except keep them, trying to keep them to eat and that kind of thing. We had a volunteer who worked at Hershey, and at the Hershey Foods, Hershey Chocolate Company annual meeting, when the board came in, they would have lots of chocolate in people's bags and that kind of things, but as soon as you break open a box, you can't sell it. So he would come after the meeting with like 12, 15 cartons of Hershey chocolate products. It's for the caseworkers to give people because so often people weren't hungry. But sweets, more often, they're calorie dense, so they're really good things. And they were like, eat these peanut butter cups because they've got lots of calories. Eat as many as you want. But the AIDS Walk were a very public way too of saying that you were supporting what was going on. So we had people who would support us but wouldn't walk because it was too public. But they'd write us a check, they'd give us money, they'd do fundraising, that kind of thing, but they wouldn't actually walk. And I don't remember, it's interesting, I don't remember ever having any of the hateful people at any of the walks. I never thought about that before right now. Because in later years, the Pride Festival in Harrisburg had a parade. And a couple of times that when I was working with Planned Parenthood, we marched in the parade because we had a lot of clients who were gay. And there were always the hate people screaming hideous and horrible things at us. My favorite being as I was walking down the street kind of near Harrisburg Hospital and my son was with me, and this hateful street ministry kind of person goes, "Now here come the babies killers." I was like, "Yes, we're here." But I don't remember that at the walk. It was usually, they were kind of joyous days, which was because we raised a lot of money and people got together. I think that was the other thing, is that there was a lot of company on that day and that was really an attractive thing for people. And there was a committee of volunteers that did a lot of the work for that.
Mm. And where did the AIDS walk take place? Was that
City Island. So we'd start at City Island and then go up the river and then come back down and come to City Island. And usually it was in the pavilion area, kind of near where the ballpark is, though I think it must have been the 93 walk. About 2 weeks before the walk, I got a call from the woman who was in charge of Parks and Rec for the city of Harrisburg. And she called me and she said, well, the AIDS walk has to move. It's like, what? Couldn't have even, it must have been a week before. It turned out that they were filming part of the movie Major League 2 on City Island, and they didn't think they were going to be done. And we were scheduled to be using a pavilion that was right next to the ballpark, but they didn't want the noise. So they wanted us to move, and it's like, I have literally hundreds of people coming on Saturday to do this. Are you kidding me? And after much back and forth, the city, and I think they got the production company to pump in some money as well. They moved us down to the parking lot, but they rented us tents and chairs and other stuff so that we could actually stage everything. And it all got done, but there was a 24-hour period there where I was ready to kill somebody because it was like, what are we going to do? Where can we go? How can I reach out to all the people who are going? Email was, we had email, but email wasn't like email was still very new. And most people didn't have it, and certainly people didn't have it at home. You know, they had it at work, but they didn't have it at home, and cell phones didn't exist. So it was like, how sort of, we don't even know who's coming, so how could we tell people to be somewhere else? We were freaking out. Oh, they also posted signs. So we basically told everybody that we could think of to tell. I think they announced it I think one of the radio stations also announced it for us, if I remember correctly. And the city put out some sort of a notice as well to help support, but it was crazy. But everybody came, we raised a lot of money, and it went fine. So it was a huge amount of work, but it was great. It was great. So I learned a lot when I was working there, there's no doubt about it. Had never used an Excel spreadsheet before going there. Did learn to love them, but it was a struggle while I learned how to do that. And then the things changed near the end of my time there. Peg Durkers was hired away by the state, and a new executive director was hired, and he turned out to be pretty much an unmitigated disaster because he talked a good game, but he didn't really know what he was doing. And he was very optimistic, but he wasn't practical. And he was a terrible manager. So he basically came very close to running the program, running the agency into the ground. And I can remember around the time I decided it was time for me to move on was when there was some talk about whether or not we'd be getting a paycheck that week. I was like, this is not good. Yeah. I have 2 kids and daycare bills. This can't go on. And I was also just getting fried anyway. So that was when I decided to leave, because he was such a disaster. The worst day one of the worst days being the day that the bookkeeper knocked on my door and said, can I talk to you for a few minutes? And I was like, sure. He's a very nice guy. And then he closed my office door, and I thought, that's not a good sign. And it turned out that the executive director had been using restricted monies for unrestricted purposes. And he had just realized it because he was working on our books. Well, as soon as he told me that, I then become essentially a mandated reporter. So I had to go into the executive director and say, if you don't fix it, it's been brought to my knowledge that this is happening. If you do not fix this, I have to report you to the Attorney General's office, and I have to do it very soon. Because it would also be about me. Yeah. Because I now had that knowledge. And he, I'll fix it. And he did fix it. But that was like, I'm done. I can't have that. I cannot be in a situation where somebody would be doing something that not only unethical, but also illegal. And apparently not worry about it. No. I think I had a very stiff drink when I got home that night. But he was just bad at what he was doing. And it can happen to any given, but if it's a really small organization, the impact is really fast. And Durkers had been a phenomenal administrator and had really kept things very tight and very moving and was a really ethical person. So that was bad. So I left then in '95, and things were really starting to change then because the triple cocktail had been put into use. I don't know how early, maybe early '95, late '94, I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and look. So it was an extraordinary experience. And I'm still friends with some people I met from that time, and it was crazy. But it changed me more than any other job that I had ever had. Probably next most would be when I was working for Planned Parenthood. Again, for some of those same reasons, that you're on the fringe, but you're also dealing with seriously life and death issues that affect people's lives in a very immediate way. I mean, if you have an unwanted pregnancy, your life stops, at least for a while you make the decision about what's next. And it's never an easy decision for anybody. And if they choose to have an abortion and move on with their lives, that's probably the best thing for them to do at that time. And to be honest with you, I don't know a single woman who's had an abortion who doesn't think for her it was the right decision at that time. This whole trope about women, I should never have done that, I think is incredible crap. Because I don't think it's true. I mean, it's a hard decision. It's a decision that nobody wants to make. But once you make it, either because you already have children or because it's not a time in your life, you couldn't support a child or whatever. I don't really care what the reason is, actually. I don't care if a woman has a reason. If it's the wrong time, it's the wrong time. Be done and move on. Because if you're not ready to be a parent, you should not be a parent. But SCAN was that same kind of thing, that it was dealing with things that every bit of money that we raised went into services for people who were sick. And for some of those people, it meant that they stayed alive long enough to be able to take advantage of the triple cocktail, or that the quality of their life was as good as possible for as long as possible. That kind of, you don't know. So it was sort of exciting and terrifying, but amazing and wonderful at the same time.
Yeah.
So.
That's amazing. Just for the sake of anybody who might watch/read this in the future who doesn't know, could you just talk, I guess I should have asked this first, but what, I mean, you talked a little bit about what SCAN does, but like education, but maybe caseworkers, what they did? Well,
mainly what people were trying to do was trying to figure out a way to help people live longer. And since a fair number of our clients were IV drug users, their systems were already affected by the drug taking. So their immune systems were already in pretty shitty shape before they got infected. So for those folks, it was a real struggle to stay healthy because they were dealing with they could be dealing with multiple things as well as their addiction, but maybe they'd had hepatitis, maybe they had hepatitis C. There could have been other whacks to their immune system before HIV, so that they were always in a delicate balance about sort of what meds might work, what meds don't work, and people would try the different kinds of meds, and they were constantly working with their doctors to try to find something like the right formulary that would work for them, because there's also pain and discomfort of various kinds, and trying to create that balance was always difficult. And the meds made people not be hungry. Well, there's only so much body fat that you can lose before you don't have enough body fat to be able to fight an infection. And that's what happened to a lot of people, that they would get something like pneumonia and they would have no reserves left to be able to fight the infection because of the wasting syndrome that set in between the meds and the not eating, that created a really unhealthy vortex for folks. And so they were stripped down in terms of their immune system, and since people also didn't really understand how HIV and AIDS worked, it was like, what do you do? So there was this constant struggle for docs trying to figure out what somebody could take, not take, can they actually withstand these, because these were incredibly powerful medicines. And they didn't know at first sort of how much is enough, how much is too much. So there was always that struggle as well. I know many of the caseworkers told their clients to find marijuana, because often what that would be, if somebody got stoned, they'd get hungry and they'd actually eat. And it's the same thing. One of my sisters had breast cancer. She's fine at the moment, but she, during the time that she was doing chemo, she basically ate fruit and yogurt, because she had no interest in eating when she was in the chemo. And the HIV meds were similar. I mean, you felt like crap. And eating was like no interest whatsoever. But that creates a very bad situation moving forward, because people lost weight so fast. So the caseworkers would often be trying to help with any kind of medical things, but also there were people who got kicked out of their apartments, got kicked out of their homes. There were parents who basically said, when their kids came out to them, kicked them out. Just kicked them to the curb, which I don't know what it would take to kick one. If one of my kids came home to me and was sick, I don't care what they're sick with, of course I would take care of them. But this was, and they would just kick people out. So there was a homelessness issue as well. So trying to find places for people to live where the landlord knew that the person was HIV positive. And lots of landlords would say no. So they were constantly in a struggle of working with, some of the churches really stepped up at that point. And so some of the churches were incredibly helpful in trying to find places for people to be able to live. But they would spend hours on the phone just trying to get somebody settled and safe so that they were housed and warm and fed and not scared about being on the street, because of course being on the street increases your possibilities of getting all kinds of infections because your exposure and everything else, and probably badly fed and not sleeping. We've come to realize that not sleeping has massive ramifications for people's health, especially if their health is fragile to begin with. So the caseworkers were always trying to get people kind of settled and safe. We're in some place, any place. There were only 2 hospice houses at that point. One in Lancaster, and Hospice of Central Pennsylvania, which is in Harrisburg, had one. I can't remember the name of the one that was in Lancaster. I don't remember, but they were active very early on and took people in when no one was doing very much at all, and gave people a quiet and warm and peaceful place to die because they'd been kicked out. Or their partner literally could not take care of them anymore. Maybe somebody was was literally physically unable to help move someone because they weren't strong enough, or they might have been sick themselves. So those were the only 2 that I knew of, and they were always full because they were actually willing and able to deal with it. So the caseworkers spent a lot of time. I mean, that was their primary goal. The education people was trying to just educate everybody. I mean, I can see the woman's face who was our educator, and I can't think of her name. But she would speak anywhere. Churches, schools, fire halls, anywhere she could actually get somebody to let her in. And she was a very warm person, so that she would come across, she came across as this sort of practical, no muss, no fuss kind of nurse almost aura to her. And she knew her stuff inside and out. So she was often very good at getting people to kind of open their brains a little bit about what was going on. I remember the Unitarian Church in Harrisburg was very, very helpful. St. Stephen's was also they're Episcopalian. And there's another one that's right. Pine Street Presbyterian, they were feeding people. So it was interesting to see the community start to come together, but it took a while, and it was definitely the religious community, the religious affiliated community stepped up first, which on some levels makes sense. The other thing that happened was that the foundation was then called the Greater Harrisburg Foundation, scored a grant from the feds to do education, but also to support HIV and AIDS education and services. And their board was really of two minds when they went to get the grant. But the foundation really stepped up and provided a lot of money for the small nonprofit organizations dealing with HIV and AIDS at a time when there was very little money to be had. And then at the same time there was the Ryan White Act. So the Ryan White money really made a huge difference in terms of being able to serve people, and that was funded through us. We were funded, that money came through the Family Health Council, which was the subcontractor for all the Ryan White money, and then they spread it out to we would apply to them. Mm-hmm. So they were the funnel through which that money came. And the Greater Harrisburg Foundation was another set of money that we could get money from them, again for direct services. But it was all very new. And for the Greater Harrisburg Foundation, which was a very conservative organization, to step up and do that, I think had a great deal to do with their executive director, a woman by the name of Janice Black, who sort of saw what was going on and said, we need to do something, because this is bad. And who else is around? And being a community foundation, you're in a position to be able to manage large grants as well, and also to distribute them, because that's what you do. So that was kind of a natural feeder once that was put in place. And those dollars really made a difference for a lot of the programs where people were being fed and housed. But it was a very fractured kind of funding scene for a long time, because again, people just didn't know what was going on. So the education people did a lot of street outreach, both day and night, and she had a small group of volunteers that would go out at night and hand out kits and talk to people and say, come in, sort of. And because part of it was also, if you're a person of color and poor and a drug addict, and a white woman says to you, come into our agency, how much trust is there? So it took time for that trust to build, and for the word to get out on the street that you could come to SCAN and get assistance, and there was nothing negative about getting there. And the office was located in a shopping center called Klein Village, which was the first shopping center in Harrisburg, right across the street from Harrisburg High School. So the neighborhood is very mixed. Parts of the neighborhood are really nice, parts of it are pretty hardcore, but it was easy to get to because we were on a bus line. We were on a good bus line. So a lot of people could come to us that way. So that made life easier for folks who were right in the city. But in terms of the day-to-day, we worked like any other nonprofit. We had clients, we tried to take care of them, we had lots of volunteers who came in and did all sorts of stuff for us. There was a group called PFLAG, Parents and Friends, Lesbian and Gays. And the PFLAG moms were great, and they would come in all the time to help us with mailings and stuffing envelopes and doing the kits, and anything we needed, they would come in and be helpful. And for a lot of these folks, their lives had been completely turned around, because more often than not, their child had not been out, and now all of a sudden they're out and they're ill. Yeah. So, but these women stepped up. And it was more often the moms. The dads, it was harder. But we had several that would come regularly to help with things as well. So they were wonderful people. I can't even imagine how hard that would be. I literally have no idea. I mean, if your kid comes to you and says, not only am I sick, but I'm dying. And there's nothing to be done. Yeah. And then the social approbation. I mean, the closest analogy I would think right now would be folks who have children who have addiction issues. And I've noticed just recently that I've seen 2 different obits where people recognized their child's struggle in the obit, where otherwise it's, died unexpectedly at home, died unexpectedly, that kind of thing. But in 2 that I saw recently, somebody said, that after a long struggle with addiction. And I thought that was so brave. So brave. But it's that kind of breakthrough that we need so that people start to recognize. And it was true with HIV and AIDS as well. I mean, I would read the obits every day because I would know people. And more often than not, nothing was said. But as time went on, people did say things in their obituaries, which again was stunningly brave to be able to do. But it was part of that change point where something goes from being very sotto voce to suddenly being part of the public conversation. Doesn't make it any easier, but it does. You can sort of see the seismic shift that happens when that changes. So other than, I'm trying to think of any other kind of things about, I feel like there's something else that we used to do. There was another event, and now I'm forgetting what it was. There were often drag shows to support the organization. That was pretty regular, but they would do that on their own and then invite us to come, but they would basically just write us a check or bring in the proceeds on the Monday or, that kind of thing. And there'd be small fundraisers, often by church groups or family groups. Somebody would have a birthday party, where they take up a collection and that kind of thing. And people would occasionally just sort of appear on our door and say, here, we did this over the weekend and here's some money. Great. You're so good. But it was a crazy time. It was a crazy time. And people didn't know. I mean, there was so much we were ignorant of in terms of everything about the course of the disease, and for a long time about transmission. How did this all sort of work? And having ignorance and well, it's all ignorance, because even when people are prejudiced, it's mainly about ignorance. But having sort of ignorance from every direction was hard. But the people I encountered were people who cared so much about what they were doing that, yes, it was a job. There's no doubt about that. We a paycheck is a good thing. But you don't do that just for the sheer old hell of it all. And obviously there was huge self-selection in terms of who would come to work for someplace like SCAN, as opposed to, I don't know, American Cancer Society or Big Brother, Big Sister, or any other kind of agency. So they were wonderful people. So.
That's amazing. I can only really think of one more question. Outside of SCAN, I know you mentioned you did some stuff at Planned Parenthood. Was there any other LGBT activism that you ever did through work or volunteering? No, just keeping in touch, sort of keeping in touch with people and supporting the center with a annual contribution, that kind of thing. But part of when I left SCAN, first I was working for the Harrisburg Area Community College Foundation, and then we went out to England for 2 years because my husband was running Dickinson's Norwich program again. So we went back to England again for 2 years. So that sort of broke off connections. You leave town for 2 years, and it's amazing how, especially then we had, by that time email was there, but still he was still pretty much at work, not at home. And you just lose track of people. So I've sort of been able to check back in with a few people that I knew from that time, but not very many. And just kind of going to events occasionally, that kind of thing. So not terribly active other than sort of vocally supportive of the community, because to not be is foolish. I mean, we got one planet. If we don't work together, we are screwed. And anything that we can do to make sure that we are working together is a benefit. So other than that, no, not really. Partially too because of where I've worked, I was always working kind of crazy hours. Just because nonprofits, the idea of a 40-hour work week and working for a small nonprofit is not usually really a good combination. Because things happen and you have to address them, or there's an event, or there's a crisis of some kind, or whatever it is, and if there's work to be done, it's all hands on deck and you get done. So
So other than that, not so much.
Okay, just last thing, I guess, we'd like to ask if there's just anything you'd like to say about your experiences or
my
messages to
experiences.
people, or...
Well, I have such huge respect for the people I worked with and for the people who were activists, volunteers at a time when that was really a hard thing to do. And people stepped up and did it anyway. And they helped change the world. I mean, I don't know that people sort of recognized it at that time, but to have these incredibly fearless people get up and self-identify as somebody who was either infected or affected in public, talk to their legislators, talk to municipalities, talk to their churches, talk to their parents. You know, I mean, people stood up in an extraordinary way that was very, very brave. And I don't know that unless you were alive at that time, so had a sense of the zeitgeist, you know, what was going on in the country, to realize how brave those people were, because they risked getting fired, they risked getting kicked out of their apartments, they risked everything, and they still stood up. And I have just immense respect for those people who did that, because they were brave. They really were. And I don't know if I don't think there's an analogy to it that's close, because even the closest thing, I mean, sort of the opiate in terms of the impact on families, but even that the level of fear attached to people who had HIV was immense. I mean, I was just working there and I got it blowback. I can't even imagine to be a patient and to walk into an office, a doctor's office, and have to deal with staff that might be terrified of you. You know, it's bold, it's brave, and it had to be fucking terrifying. But people stood up, and they made a difference. And every time I hear the name Anthony Fauci, who is the current director of the NIH, infectious disease area, he was the guy in the federal government who stood up and said, we have to do something, and we have to do it now. And he took huge heat for it. And he didn't shut up. He just kept talking and talking and talking and making things happen. And every time I see him, he's got to be getting close to retirement, but it's just like, you know, thank you for what you did. But that's what it takes in a situation like this. It takes people who have conscience and who have ethics and morals and say, this is not right. I mean, it's the people who stood up against slavery. It's the people who said women need to have the right to vote. It's those people who put themselves on the front line and say, this is wrong and it has to change. And with this particular situation, it was people taking their lives in their hands. Because people got beat up, people got shot. I mean, people got hurt when they stood up. And gay folks were getting beaten up all the time. I don't know if I hope that's changed. But I mean, at that time, that was a real issue. You know, coming out of a gay bar and there'd be a bunch of yahoos who would beat people up. So I have just the huge respect I have for the people who did stand up and really made a difference for everybody. Because you can't, if you have something that's happening in terms of the arena of public health and you don't pay attention to it, then you put millions of people at risk.
Yeah.
And they did it. So I'll get off my soapbox.
That's a good idea.